Hello, everyone. Looks like we are on the air and being recorded. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Miles Smith, who those of you who have followed the Petrarch Institute would know. And here we also have a returning guest who's been here once before. He had been talking about the anti-axial age. Dr. Steve Balch, who you may recall was the founding president of the National Association of Scholars for many years. He founded the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization at Texas Tech, a winner of the National Humanities Medal given to him by President Bush. Was that 2007? Or so, and a generally esteemed and estimable guest. I don't know, you want to say hello to everyone, Steve?
Greetings, all you folks out there, fellow sufferer human beings. You have my peace and blessing.
Excellent. Well, one of the things the Petrarch Institute is starting to get into is a concept which at one time at least was called metahistory. And we just did a course we just completed a course which is available on Udemy. I'll put the link below, on Christopher Dawson and his work, The Making of Europe. Now, Dawson, in a 1951 essay called The Problem of Metahistory, wrote the following. He wrote, "When Aristotle had written his books on physics, he proceeded to discuss the ultimate concepts that underlie his physical theories, the nature of matter, the nature of being, and the cause of motion and change. In the same way, metahistory is concerned with the nature of history, the meaning of history, and the cause and significance of historical change. The historian himself is primarily engaged in the study of the past." Dawson distinguishes between history, which is the study of the past, and metahistory, which is concerned with understanding the fundamental dynamics of history, whether history has a meaning and purpose, the causes of historical change, and so forth, these much grander questions. And Steve is one of those audacious souls, courageous souls, we could say, willing to expend his erudition on this question of whether we can discern an overall pattern or theme in history. Now, Steve, from what I understand, it seems like part of your project is, or a central part of your project is what you call organicism, which is perhaps in some sense, you can explain it better than me, but perhaps in some sense, subsuming the story of mankind, the story of human history within the larger framework of life history, within the larger framework of the biological, geological, and ecological story of the earth, perhaps. It's something that has been seen perhaps in the past at times, the effort to analogize processes of history to organic processes. We could think, for example, as the theory of evolution is becoming very powerful in the 19th century, Herbert Spencer has a sort of somewhat progressivist theory of history derived from the notion of evolution and the idea of increasing complexity. And then we have Oswald Spengler analogized history to the life cycle and had a rather darker vision of the fate, certainly, of Western civilization. So I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you would be, what do you think an organic concept of history sort of brings to the table? What kind of insights do you think it gives us that other approaches might not be as effective in doing?
Well, I think a lot of people, even if they don't make this their profession, want to see their own lives and perhaps the longer career of humanity as part of, if they can, as part of something bigger. So that's that idea, trying to put it in that larger frame, has long fascinated me. And I guess motivationally speaking, and I assume that it's true for others who have followed this route, motivationally thinking, it's led me down this particular path. Um, I do think, though, that there is a fundamental continuity between life history seen from its inception on Earth, perhaps 3.5 billion years ago, conceivably somewhat earlier, and human history as it has been unfolding over, say, the last 200,000 years. And I think the common element in both, what ties both together, is that they are both processes of learning. They are both ways in which um, adaptation to a complicated and difficult, very challenging environment occurs. I see human history as a kind of supercharged extension of the learning process that has been going forward since the advent of life on Earth. What do I mean by learning, and what is being learned? Well, one can gauge this at a very high level of abstraction, and I think to make the parallelism work, that level of abstraction has to be rather high. What life is in an otherwise entropic universe, what life represents, is a very high degree and a very improbable degree of complexity. Um, that's what life as an organic phenomenon represents, and that's what I think, taken further, human culture and all the works of human beings represent. So, at its most abstract level, a system arose on our planet, perhaps elsewhere too, but we know it on our planet. A system arose in which a device developed that was capable of discovering what viable forms of unusual complexity were out there. It discovered these forms essentially by creating them. And it did it initially in the standard Darwinian fashion of replication with some small amount of variation. The variations being tested according to their ability to replicate further. And this very gradual process over 3.5 billion years, producing all the living things we now have on the Earth. And of course, as more and more of these improbably complex organic structures, organic because they're carbon-based, as these developed, they of course became the environment, part of the environment, a major part of the environment, within which the searching after further forms of possible complexity occurred. So a somewhat self-contained system within the larger space of purely simple physical matter developed on the planet. What humans now, as this process went on, the search mechanisms improved. They didn't improve because they were selected to improve. They improved because their initial instantiations helped whatever creature had them to better replicate in the short term. But in the longer sense, they represented better ways of searching out the possibilities of improbable complexity. So if you just take a look at, how early creatures evolved, perhaps the earliest of all creatures were nothing more than self-catalyzing chemical systems. Eventually, the information that one might say was contained in a self-catalyzing chemical system became embodied in a particular set of molecules. Perhaps originally it was something like RNA. Eventually it became DNA, improved with RNA, then sort of assigned other kinds of functions in sustaining cellular metabolism. The reaction became contained. It was no longer a naked replicating molecule. It was contained within what we now call a cell. Eventually, as eukaryotic creatures emerged, maybe about 2.5 million years ago, the DNA became assorted into chromosomes that were within a nucleus within the cell, better protected. These all represented a greater sophistication in how the information that allowed the search process to go forward was configured, preserved, and allowed to trigger the second order metabolic processes that allowed the entire creature, the phenotype, now we're talking about phenotypes as opposed to genotypes, the phenotype to survive. Eventually, you had phenotypes so complicated that they were able to learn how to survive within their own lifetimes rather than just being dependent on whatever they inherited from their ancestors. So you get the beginning of learning. You actually see this to some degree in unicellular creatures. They can learn. But of course, metazoa with nervous systems can learn presumably in an even more complicated fashion. And so now you have living entities that are no longer simply dependent on a set of adaptive instructions that they receive from their ancestors, but are now capable of modifying them in a way during their own lifetime. What humanity represents, apart from having a very advanced nervous system and the capabilities to learn, what humanity represents with the advent of language, which appeared slowly, no doubt, and has some basis in signaling by other creatures. But with the advent of language, you get a whole new, what I call meta-evolutionary. Meta-evolutionary means the improvement of the information systems upon which evolutionary learning is based. You have a whole new meta-evolutionary system with language, and it's now cumulative over the lifetimes of individuals. It can be, information can be passed not only through the genes, but through, one might say, the memes from one creature to another. And so culture begins to become cumulative. Learned behavior now accumulates in the same way that early on behavior based on pure replication, genetic-based behavior, had found a means to accumulate. Now, learned behavior finds a means to accumulate over the long term. And that's a big, big meta-evolutionary jump. And it inaugurates, as I see it, it inaugurates this sort of second great phase of evolution, the cultural phase, in which learning, the original learning system becomes supercharged because now it can move very quickly. It can develop, and it's no longer purely accidental. The human beings are capable, other animals probably too in a primitive way, but human beings are capable of mentally modeling the external world so that it can try out adaptive possibilities virtually, one might say. We'll try them out and to another, but they're also, in terms of the learning itself, able to mentally model it. And this speeds up adaptation in the human line immensely. And in fact, leads with the consequences, because they abrade against each other, leads to the creation of two worlds. You know, we've come to speak since Lovelock's famous, that wrong? Is that right in Greek? Meaning the sphere of organic life and all the things that's created, the goddess Gaia pronunciation. But I think, and I sort of borrow from mythology here, I think you can say side by side another mythic creature, on I think was it the Titans, and was their offspring. You can correct me on that if that's wrong. But I call the artificial world, and I use that term advisedly. I mean, it's really not any more artificial. And it is made of different materials because humans have learned much more thoroughly than their non-human predecessors how to incorporate all kinds of all kinds of ingredients, all kinds of materials, some synthesized uniquely through chemical processes that don't ordinarily occur. You know, you go age and you can see this beginning to happen. So there's a whole parallel world sort of encased Gaia, but not quite the same as she, dependent on her, but having taken on and in that life of its own created all sorts of problems, harmonization problems that we talk commonly today. Certainly, the environmental movement has been created to address those environmental problems. For vastly successful as an enterprise, this meta evolutionary that humans have been able to take. Sources of energy, and in looking at life history, the two big changes that you see, and I think the other changes are mainly subsidiary upon them. The two big changes that you see over time are A, information technology change, it's meta-evolutionary change, and B, harvesting new sources of energy. So, originally the source of energy was probably geothermal. As photosynthetic processes developed, it became sunlight, photosynthesis, at least the kind that that's most common in the world, is as an end product oxygen. Oxygen originally was tremendously toxic to the forms of life that existed when it first appeared, but they adapted to it and they turned it into another energy source. So you see these kind of energetic events occurring as life becomes more meta-evolutionarily sophisticated and can harvest more. Same thing in human history. In fact, you see both meta-evolution and energetic events in human history. So the invention of writing is obviously, I would see, as a meta event. The development of alphabets, of decimal systems for recording quantities, printing. Those are very big ones. You could find more refined meta-evolutionary advances. And of course, there are great energetic, goes into kind of two categories. The use of sort of activating energy, like the invention of fire, which was a terribly important step forward, but also binding energy, where you find new cementing forms. And so the history of metallurgy would fall under there. And again, loads and loads of engine. So at the base of the Industrial Revolution. You also have on the meta-evolutionary, I call epistemes, but you call them epistemes. We'll have to let common usage here eventually decide in what language it should be. The pronunciation is best. Ways of understanding and probing. They're not to be found in life history. This is purely ways of founding and probing the environment around you and transmitting knowledge of it. And they start off at the first level. I have four: ordinary commonsensical human understanding, which has evolved and is supplemented to some degree by culture. You know, we learn all these helpful lessons in life from our and others. Uh, the second level is a more complicated one, and it's mythic, mythopoetic, and that's how early humans understood the more cosmic aspects, not the everyday aspects, but the more cosmic aspects of the world, and religion is included in that. And while it may, in many respects, be fanciful, totemic, um, in various cultures. Then the third is more rigorous. It's an effort to look at the world in a way, to care about definitions, to care about the structure of one's analysis. And it's basically philosophy. Its primary tool is logic, but also the dialectic and the arguments that go on in which people are forced to sharpen how they think. That was a very important. By itself, I say it wasn't enough. I argue it wasn't enough to carry us forward into modernity, but that it occurs in every civilization in somewhat different interests and different levels of sophistication and refinement. Um, we in the West think of it mainly as part of the Greek heritage, but there are and Chinese equivalents, and in India especially. You have, you know, at the kind of metaphysical level and logical level, a set of systems, I think, that can stand those of the West. So that's the third episteme. And the fourth is science, is modern science. And what you do there is you don't confine yourself anymore, as the third episteme pretty much did. Not entirely, but pretty much. To verbal exchanges. It's no longer simply a matter of words. It now becomes a matter of very sharp, not only very sharp logic, but very sharp is uh, augmented by purpose-built instruments to make that observation more powerful, to get it where ordinary you wouldn't go. It also involves going beyond just logic to mathematics, to trying to structure one's understanding of the world mathematically. And it also involves an effort to look at phenomena in a multi-angular way, constantly changing your perspective. And I think that's essentially what the experimental method does. It takes a set of phenomena, and by varying the happening, by factoring out characteristics of don't seem to directly deal with are that one is trying to get at. So in a nutshell, I guess that's what I'd say. It's that's how modern science is distinguished from the older philosophical types of inquiries. It shares things with him, but and for some things, the older types of inquiry are probably still better. But with respect to the natural world, science, kind of using those developments, has been able to give us the understanding needed for the great leap forward that modernity represents. And it's something hard to come by because it is just argue with each other, and making them get their hands dirty with mechanical things and learn new skills like mathematics. Part of the trivium, quadrivium. But it was hard to do. It only occurs once, and as to why I think it occurred in the West first. And of course, once it occurs, no one else is going to have to do it. So, but it could have occurred anyway. So that's kind of not lots of particulars, like in the treatment of the scientific and these concepts to situation that we're now in the present.
Well, that was actually quite capacious there, Steve. I mean, there's lots of thoughts and questions that I have, but I'm sure Miles has been waiting patiently. Miles, did you have any questions or thoughts that you wanted to raise with Steve?
Well, it's extremely, it's extremely a big picture on at least two axes, right? It's very broad in its scope, and it has a lot of disciplinary perspectives folded into it. One thing that's always a bit tricky is the idea of progress, because it's one of those things where if it's thrown about in the right way, people think they know what it means. I had in part of my work in the private sector, when I was in a bank environment, I had a more seasoned consultant colleague who was from the boomer generation. And he was talking about economic activity and growth. And he said, as long as there's progress, everything's fine. So I asked him, progress towards what? And he just said, now you're getting spiritual. And he would not elaborate. So he knew that we had to have progress. It probably mapped onto economic well-being widely distributed, something like that, opportunity, choice, that kind of thing. But any attempt to ask what the basis of and the basis for solidarity on progress was totally opaque in that worldview. So, as we go from your very scholarly perspective to the question of, what kind of use you'd like to see this theoretical approach put to, is there a way you could encapsulate for the intellectual or the enlightened lay reader what the benefit at the, say, the individual or the communal level is to taking this backward glance, right, at this long continuum from evolution into adaptation and the supercharges that push it along? And you were very clear that this isn't a theoretical model that's meant to predict things. So would there be war with China or something like that, or what's the price of gold going to be? But when you look at what you might call cumulative and anti-cumulative forces in your picture, do you sort of have a sense of where you think we're going in the big we sense over the next thousands of years and whatnot?
So if you look at the natural world, I think you can see progress in a limited technical way. If you can then that we'd apply to it to apply the human. As time goes on, there's more and more life. It has, there are various quantitative measures within it. It doesn't overall move toward complexity, but the most complex creatures in it tend to be more complex than the ones that came before. Those are very general statements, which can in some instances be shown not to correspond to the long-term trend. But in general, I think that's what happens in life history. In human history, you do see at the technical level up to now, you do see a cumulative process. So we have better tools, really what it comes down to, than we had before. Meta-evolutionary, energetic, we have better tools. What is harder to argue is whether there is moral progress, whether the world is more virtuous as time goes on. By our present standards, the world has never been particularly virtuous. If we look back into the past, we sort of look back at this, at least as we would judge it. it's not also clear that the kind of morality that we think of as normative today, that our more enlightened people, and even ourselves right here, would think of as normative today, is in plain old evolutionary terms the most adaptive morality to have. It's a morality that reflects things that we as beings who have managed in some respects to separate ourselves from the underlying evolutionary logic that brought us into being. It's a morality that we have created that lies to some degree outside of the mechanisms of evolution, be they operating organically among animals or culturally among humans. I talk in the book about something called phenocracy, in which the phenotype, the human being in this case, begins to see its not as a survival machine for its genes, to use Richard Dawkins' famous formulation. And I think a lot of our morality nowadays, like utilitarianism, for example, utilitarianism and it's almost the default, I would suspect, today for most people. You ask about a public policy, and whether it's good or bad will have a very lot to do with whether you can make the case that it will make more people feel better than before. There are other systems out there, and they have a good deal to say for themselves. But utilitarianism is almost our default system nowadays. Utilitarianism, seeking to maximize the satisfactions of life, is not what evolution is all about. In fact, the pains that we and our animal friends feel, the suffering that we and our animal undergo, the anxieties, I don't know about animals here, but that we have as beings who can look forward into the future and worry about what our state of affairs will be or what humanity's state. We think those are by and large bad things. We'd prefer to do away with as much pain and suffering as we can. But pain and suffering have programmed into us by evolution for a very good reason. From evolution's point of view, that is, say, the replication of genes, they help. It helps to be fearful about dying, because that keeps you alive. If you were oblivious to it during the short run that you have, pain, anxiety, all these things are necessary motivators us to carry out our adaptive life strategies in the best possible way. But as phenocentric beings, as beings that want to reorganize the world according to a phenocratic model, where the phenotype rules, those things are to be minimized. We would like to think, possible if we're very smart, to figure out strategies that keep us individually and humanity collectively going, that reduce suffering to a bare minimum. I don't think ever eliminate it. The whole desire to reduce suffering to a bare meaning is itself the result of anxieties. So there has to be some degree of negativity to keep us going. We might be able to reduce it. But so what I'm trying to circle back here, as we now frequently say in the U.S., to circle back, our notions, modern notions of morality, are phenocentric. And if we look back into the past, when life was lived much closer to the margins than the great plenty that we experience today now allows us to, we're much further from the margins of existence than we used to be. If you look back in those older days, people's sort of operative notions of right and wrong were much harsher, and they almost had to be. So if we consider the sort of morality that we have today to represent progress, We have to ask what very special circumstances brought us to this state of adaptive mastery that allows us to draw back from the edge of existence and think about things in phenocratic terms. And that there, I don't think progress is necessarily in the cards. To sustain what we now have is not as going to be as easy for us as it was simply to accumulate increasingly effective gadgets. To sustain what we have at the very high level that we have achieved requires a system to be in effect, a system. It requires the kind of constitutional order, the kind of, Kant talks about the sweetness of commerce. It requires a life, I call this the world made safe for making, a life in which people, by taking things from others, which was literally speaking, the royal route to success. In earlier times, you sat on top of the food chain as the king or the aristocrat, and you taxed people, and if they didn't pay up, you did bad things to them, and you fought with others in similar positions over how big a tax catchment you would have. Well, nowadays the route to success, is commercial. It's coming up with new inventions, commercial and technical, that other people want. It's to go back to biological language, rather than being predatory, as were the kings of old, rather than that being the top strategy. The top strategy in the kind of system we have created is mutualistic. You come up with things that other people would like to get from you, and then you engage in exchanges with them. They pay you, you give them. This is very unusual. It's the great anomaly, as I say in the book. It's a very unusual set of affairs. And it's not one that is self-sustaining. It's one that either depends on a fortunate distribution of resources, which Europe enjoyed during the late medieval and early modern periods, or the medieval and early modern periods, or if that distribution of resources no longer persists, as I think it doesn't quite so much anymore, it depends on understanding the advantages that society gets from this state of affairs. And that involves an education that inculcates an understanding of that kind. And we seem to have an education in the Western world taken over by our intellectuals, who are more takers than makers, aimed at undermining rather than enhancing that system. So I think, as far as meta-evolutionary, you can have meta-evolutionary tools like computers or writing, but you also can have meta-evolutionary systems like our constitutional commercialized modern system. And those systems are not cumulative in the same obvious way as the tools are. Their foundations can be destroyed. People aren't going to abandon computers, whatever the future holds. I think we'll have computers, but they may not have constitutional orders of the kind that we have. And if they don't, they'll be living under a state of affairs that, in terms of the morality we have today, which we'd like to think of as peak morality, will be different and much less pleasant. So I don't think the moral progress, depending on all these things, is as much in the cards as the purely technical kind.
Steve, I wanted to ask just a question about things that people might occur to people, and even you, I think, in your work have touched on it with the idea of phenocracy, which is potential disanalogies between biological processes or evolutionary processes and human history. One of them that comes to mind when you were talking about the fourth episteme would be the fact that human beings sort of self-consciously look at the future, right? So, I mean, Francis Bacon, organisms don't think, well, if I keep going on this way, maybe in a couple of million years, I'll turn into that and become yet more powerful than I am now. But Francis Bacon, almost, if you read, the Novum Organum, almost quite consciously talks about how we can change the future by conquering nature and understanding it in order to command it. He's sort of prophesying this technological world order. The other aspect, so there's the fact of human agency and prognostication that seems absent from, let's say, primitive organisms, where we're talking about, I mean, when we look at evolutionary processes, we seem to be talking about, on the one hand, natural causality, sort of deterministic processes, and on the other hand, random events. The meteor hits the Earth in the age of the dinosaurs, or random mutations, or these sort of things. But in the case of humans, we seem to have purposeful agency. The other is that, especially, I mean, certainly there seems to be a lot in human behavior, human history, that we can analogize, let's say, to primate behavior, like our tribalism, our tribal wars and conflicts and battles for resources and mates and this sort of thing, which can be easily perhaps reduced to a Darwinistic thing. But when we turn to things like, the Pythagoreans contemplating number as the foundation of the universe, or Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, it seems much less obvious, at least, right? I think, to many people, that we can reduce this to the basic drivers that are said to be of evolution, of survival of the individual and perpetuation of the species, right? I mean, there seems to be a kind of complexity. And I think even your own theory of enocracy kind of talks about the fact that we can sort of resist our genes, or surpass our genes. So I'm just wondering, do you see that as creating a challenge to your theory? The fact that some human behavior doesn't seem easily explicable in terms of the base drivers of evolution, and the fact that human choice and agency seems to play a role in human history, or do you think it can be folded in pretty well to your general life history story?
Well, I mean, I'm arguing evolution evolves, so you would not expect that later stages would necessarily be even in some very important particulars, like the earlier ones. It becomes more self-conscious. The sort of neurological part of it attempts to supersede the purely genetic part of it. Unless, of course, you find a new way of basing thought, you at least have to keep producing bodies. It's hard to get away from that completely, though it raises the question of whether that indeed is a possibility down the road. Of course, many people talk about this. The very fundamental part of it, the search process, looking for new ways to sustain improbable complexity. I think that applies. That's a very high level abstraction, but I think that applies to all of it. You do get, however, as things progress, an understanding on the part of life, not only an understanding that there is a future and that the future can be better, and sort of Baconian idea of progress, very early breakthrough instance of this. But you also get, I mean, if I'm right, capable of stumbling upon not only ways of discovering better forms of adaptation, but also is capable of stumbling upon motivational systems. Even if you look at animals, we assume they can't tell us, and we can't hence be sure, but they seem to like certain things, and you seem to be able to modify their behavior by offering them things that they like. You feed your cats and they jump up and down. We have outdoor cats, so as I approach them through the glass door, you can see them. They're joyous. They're getting fed. One assumes that they're having a happy feeling at that point. And of course, we certainly have those feelings, and we tend to put the greatest value on them. As I said before, we're kind of ultimately, most of us, you can therefore imagine a future for the evolutionary process in which the process of looking for complexity as a be-all, end-all becomes more refined. And what one wants to then do in this forward, which we're already in, this forward looking evolutionary process, is find those forms of improbable complexity that correspond to greater feelings of satisfaction. Some improbable complexity are very unpleasant for those who experience them. They work, but they get you to where you have to be to sustain, but they're not pleasant to experience. But there are some that are pleasant to experience. And maybe eventually what highly self-conscious life will seek to do in human form or in something beyond human form will be to survive in a highly complicated way, but which is also a highly pleasant way. And I think that would probably necessitate very high intelligence in which you can see very far forward. I mean, usually the unpleasant things are things that we stumble into and then have to scramble to get out of. So, you put your finger on the hot stove and you withdraw it. Or the analogy that the example that I use in the book, a man turns a corner on a road in the jungle and sees a tiger. So nice feelings, a nice reaction to that is probably not what's going to extricate you, if you can be extricated at all, from the situation. You're going to have to run away as fast as possible. And what serves you best is, in that circumstance, is fright. Though one of my readers said, no, you don't run away. I mean, you can't outrun the tiger. What you got to do after having been frightened in this manner is run at the tiger and try to frighten it, yelling and screaming and waving your hands. So maybe it'll run off. That's probably right. But it doesn't.
You probably need a book with what you're supposed to do when encountering various different animals, because they also
that's right, Ralph. So the guy who suggested this is a very smart man. But in any event, it's fright. Fright is what is required. So what you want to do is not stumble upon tigers. If you're so smart and so forward-looking that you can see all these possible frightening episodes that you want to avoid, and you avoid them, you never get to them. You just steer a course. Life becomes like life on a cruise ship. You just steer a course for pleasant places and have a good time, and no one ever presents you with a terrible bill that you have to pay because you've gotten yourself so rich that you can afford a life that's an endless cruise. Well, maybe that's where this process of evolution heads, and the whole universe gets reorganized into I even have a term for it, a highly intelligent bliss being that can operate in a way that, if it doesn't totally reduce unpleasantness, just pares it down to the utmost minimum, and almost everything is nice. Maybe that's where, if there is a telos, maybe that's what it points to. But maybe
Miles,
not.
Maybe
we just blow ourselves up tomorrow and don't get there.
Miles, did you have anything you wanted to ask?
Well, I thought it might be interesting to compare this type of ultra widescreen, big theater, we're calling it metahistory approach, or theory of, or analytical framework for history approach, in which natural history kind of segues into human history, and there's both supercharging and continuity. With just some impressions, and I'm purely a student of history rather than a historian, so it's again a little bit like my previous question, a little bit of the layman's question. If I think of some of the great historians of different types, they often ask crucible questions. So what was something like at, or what was going on at a very pivotal moment, and they might look at determining factors or mechanical factors in that crucible, but they also seem to look at the ineluctable human factor, the role of a leader. So, if I think like someone like Thucydides, one thing that's really interesting about him is you can tell almost by what type of text he's got, whether it's, say, a speech or a battle description, what type of forces he's looking at. But when you look at the speeches, you seem to see a kind of pivotal moment of persuasion where a person who can capture or motivate or galvanize makes a much bigger difference than all the organic compounds in the room at once. And if you think about the difference between, I think, what you're talking about and what you could call determinist historians like, say, Braudel or Jared Diamond, they are often looking at determining factors which are just geographical settings or inanimate mechanical factors. I think you're mostly interested in vital ones, but the perspective is really one from an incredibly high altitude, a geographic satellite altitude. Jacques Barzun, who I guess could be called something like a romantic and liberal historian. Those are some of his passions. He often says the historian is busy with answering, was it really like that? So if 400 years separate me from someone in the 17th century, if I can picture what things were like, then I can relate to the person in terms of their motivations and their actions. I can understand if their clothing was really as uncomfortable as I imagine, or was the room really as stifling as I think. Was their food rancid? There are all these things that make it like my life, allow me to sort of telescope through time and enter, but in a very intimate way, another setting. And so I just is as you take this ultra wide, million and billion year canvas, does that kind of crucible or inserted perspective of the historian matter less, or does it have to be incorporated in a different way?
Well, at the very end of the book, I actually talk about how my argument relates to the great man, or I suppose we should say great person, but they all tend to be men, theory, at least up to now. I think there have been people who had been at crucible moments and have made a difference. And I think if you wanted to set it at the high realm of abstraction that I seem to like, you might say that there are people who managed to greatly reduce the element of contingency in a situation going forward. That there were lots of possibilities before they arrived. And after they arrived, there were many fewer. And there was a kind of greater path dependency from well, I mean, there are always moments like that, of moments of contingency, but they created injected into the works a great deal of path dependency. So they're not always the people you would think. Most people, I mean, they're not always the heroes. They're not always the Alexander the Great. So I think he probably does belong in that category. There can be people like Constantine. Constantine decided that Christianity was going to be the favored religion in his time. It didn't get beyond being the one he patronized, but he put it on the road to becoming the official religion, and then the only religion, except for the carved out little place for Judaism that was allowed, the only religion that could be practiced in Christendom, as it thereafter became. So here was a man who was not the greatest of great men by any means, but who made a decision that had immense and lasting consequence. And there are a small number of other people who stood at those crossroads. And in retrospect, or sometimes even in the case of Constantine, almost at the time, though you couldn't be sure that his decision would hold when he made it, who made these vastly consequential decisions. So there is indeterminacy in the process, particularly when you get down to the human level. I mean, there's right now indeterminacy. We don't know whether this evolutionary experiment this supercharging of the learning system is going to lead to, vast conquests of some type or other in the future, or is going to turn out to be a failure, whether, Gaia will assume her sole rule, and Urania will collapse, and vanish, turn out to be a dead end, at least here on Earth. So you don't know that. So it's not a purely deterministic system, though obviously it sees at the purely biological level, it sees, of course, in a billion years or so, most people tell us that the Earth will no longer be a fit habitation for life. So even that experiment is largely, it's kind of 3/4 of its way through, at best.
We should invest in space travel, right? We should be already.
Well, I think if there's a future for life of both the organic and human sort, it probably has to take flight. Yes.
No, Noah's Ark, as it were. Just maybe we're drawing close to the end, but I just wanted to touch again on this issue of progress and decline and organicism, sort of bringing them together. I mean, one of the things that one notes looking at the history of metahistory, we could say, in terms of people who've looked at the organic models as a model for history, is that they take very different lessons from it, right? So like Herbert Spencer talks about the evanescence of evil and seems to have a very, in accord with much of the spirit of Britain in the 19th century, which was an ascendant power, and the general sense of improvements in the modern age. He views evolution as a progressive force, and he sees history as also progressive on that model. Just a bit later, after World War I, Oswald Spengler writes his Decline of the West, where he uses an organic model of the life cycle and argues that the West is basically dying in its dying phase of history. And maybe one of the things that one could take is that, if we look at, let's say, the 18th century Marquis de Condorcet talks about moral and material progress as going hand in hand, right? And certainly the material progress is easier to quantify, easier to have metrics for the improvements in machinery. But when we look at the moral side, you could argue that human beings have continually gotten in the way of, the last century, arguably, was perhaps, maybe Genghis Khan could give it a go, but it was probably the bloodiest century in history. A lot of that made possible precisely by these highly educated scientific methodologies, which modernity had developed. We hope the 21st won't be that way. We're assured by the Enlightenment's heirs like Steven Pinker that things are getting better and better. But you actually seem to shed some doubt on this, right? I mean, with your notion of the Cognoscentency.
Yes, right. Well, it can't go in the time remaining. I can't get deeply into this, but I do think that the order of the world's safe for making, a world of ordered freedom, is jeopardized by a variety of things. And it's jeopardized today from one quarter. It's not the only source of jeopardy, but it's jeopardied from one quarter by the immense influence that non-scientific intellectuals, I don't want to say humanists, that's a word that should be reserved for higher things. And there are real humanists around. I mean, I hope I'm one of them, and you guys are too. So they certainly exist in large number. But there's another kind of pseudo-humanist, someone who doesn't have the real tools of science, but who has been emboldened by a scientific culture to pretend to have theory and to understand. And this kind of humanist I call them mind workers. I think that's more fitting to real status. There are people who kind of deal in ideas, but who have come to deal with them in a self-interested way. Self-interested in the sense that the way they deal with ideas forwards the interest of the guild that they represent. And these people are basically purveyors of new mythos, of new forms of kind of delusion. We see it all around us. I don't think we've ever lived in a society that is so governed by strange, fabulistic ideas that ordinary common sense at most times past would have been able to see through, but have gained the currency because of the power of this new mind-working group, mainly a power situated in our universities, which are bastions of defense for the kind of fabulations confabulations that these mind workers come up with. So that was an unforeseen development. You know, we in the past thought that we might be conquered by, militarists and ideological crazies like Hitler, but we're in danger of being conquered. I don't know how long their rule would last, but we're in danger of having our very good institutions torn down by these kind of new forms of ranters and zealots and kind of religious ravers. They're not religious in the old-fashioned sense, but they've come up with new types of religions and creeds and sects. And those who want to see this argument more developed will have an opportunity in my book when it appears. But yeah, I see that as a peculiar danger of our times. And I coined the word cognoscentency to capture the fact that this kind of mind working now has a much greater power in our civilization than it ever had in civilizations before, where it was in a variety of ways contained. It's not contained in ours. So
Yeah.
that's not the only thing that could do us in, but that's not the only thing that could do us in, but it's a new thing that could do us in, and it's a serious danger.
Well, that was a very interesting discussion, Steve. Thanks a lot for being with us today and sharing your thoughts. It should be, let us know, of course, when the book comes out. It should be very interesting. It'll be interesting to see what kind of reaction and thoughts as well that it elicits in the broader scholarly community. So thanks a lot again, Steve.
I'm rushing in where angels fear to tread. So I might the reaction to it in the world of cultivation may be, I guess at worst, a total disinterest, which I suspect is what happens to most things like this when they arrive. But better would be round repudiation, because at least that would get it read. Mockery and repudiation would get it read, and maybe I can hope for the development of some degree of appreciation. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah, so vituperation from the New York Review of Books or something like that would be something devoutly to be wished in some sense.
The book has something in it for everybody to hate.
Well, at all events, I mean, there's only a relatively small people who have taken on a project this ambitious as trying to unfold the fundamental processes of world history and tie it in even to Earth history in general. So in that respect, certainly you merit kudos, Steve. So it'll be interesting. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for coming, and hope to see you. And again, to have a look at our courses on Udemy, and in particular our latest course on Christopher Dawson. We should be coming up with one pretty soon on Plato's Republic, which I hope will be interesting for people, and see everyone soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Till next time.